Follow the science is a mantra that shuts down debate about values and often even about science itself. From climate change to COVID, from salt intake to uh, all sorts of different medical issues, politicians, politicalists, special interest groups, and others claim their policies flow by logical necessity from the science. To disagree is to be mentally deficient science deniers, ill-educated rubes with nothing to contribute to public debates. Despite adherents' claims of scientific sophistication, however, this tactic is actually harmful to science as well as to public discourse. I'm Cal Beisner. I'm the president, the founder and national spokesman of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. Thank you for joining us for our program this evening from the stacks. I think we've got a very stimulating discussion ahead for you. Before we jump into that, I just want to remind people that every month the Cornwall Alliance will send, as our way of saying thank you, for a tax-deductible donation of literally any size, an educational resource. This month, our resource is this new book just published, literally hot off the press, called Biblical Foundations for Economics. This is a book that I wrote and that I hope that many people will find very helpful. To request your copy, just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, just type in promo code 21-10, that's promo code 21-10, plus the title, Biblical Foundations for Economics. And we'll be glad to send you a free copy of this brand new book. Well, our guest tonight, John O. McGinnis, is the George C. Dix Professor in Constitutional Law at Northwestern University. He's a contributing editor at the journal Law and Liberty. His book, Accelerating Democracy, was published by Princeton University Press in 2012, and he's also the co-author with Mike Rappaport of Originalism and the Good Constitution, published by Harvard University Press in 2013. Dr. McGinnis is a graduate of Harvard College, Balliol College at Oxford University, and the Harvard Law School. He's published in leading law reviews, including the Harvard, Chicago, and Stanford Law Reviews, and the Yale Law Journal, and in journals of opinion, including National Affairs and National Review. John, welcome to the program this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we dive into your article, would you just tell us a little bit about yourself? I missed the article, Blinded by Science, back when it first appeared almost exactly a year ago in Law and Liberty. And I'm eager to discuss it, but I want people to know who you are, a bit about your background. So welcome.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. Well, I'm as you said, a professor of law. I'm from New York City, though I've now moved to Chicago. I live here with my wife and daughter, my 5-year-old daughter. And my interests in academics are pretty wide-ranging. I'm interested in constitutional law, as the book on originalism suggests, but I'm also very interested in technology because when I was young, I think I missed out on computer science. I did not realize how that would transform the contours of our world. And I don't really want to miss out on that again. And so I think anyone interested in the modern world wants to think about how technology, and particularly computational technology, is changing our world for good, for bad. And I think any social theorist is interested in doing that. So besides my academic work, I'm very interested in writing for the public, and Law and Liberty is a site that's published by the Liberty Fund, an organization of classical liberals run out of Indianapolis. I also
Outstanding group.
write for the City Journal, which is the publication of the Manhattan Institute. And this, I think, is very important, not to, as an academic, not simply to write for other professionals, but to write for the world at large, because there's not, I think, enough people who are trying to bring perhaps a bit of academic rigor to our public policy debates, and that's important, particularly in our era of increased partisanship and polarization.
Yeah, you mentioned the Liberty Fund, and I love that organization and have bought many, many of their books. This is a great opportunity to recommend it to people. Uh, they do an amazing job reprinting classic works on liberty and on what we would call classical liberalism, as well as publishing new works. And they do them in high style, really, really high quality publishing and at amazingly low prices. So libertyfund.org is where all our viewers can go, and just beware, you're likely to spend yourself into oblivion when you go there, not because of high prices, but because of so much good stuff. Well, John, as I said, I missed Blinded by Scientism, your article in Law and Liberty, back when it first appeared. And I just encountered it for the first time about 2 months ago. And immediately I realized it deserved discussion on the Cornwall Alliance's live stream, because we too are deeply concerned about the same problem. So I want to start actually by jumping right to the end of the article. There you call Scientism and Populism evil twins of civic discourse. So let's start by defining terms. What do you mean by scientism and populism in that context?
Well, in this context, I'm talking about scientism, and I think you introduced it well at the start of the program. The idea that we can follow science and therefore simply from scientific facts derive public policy ideas. And as you suggested, politicians often say that. And what actually they're trying to do is stop debate about what always drives our and should drive our public policy, which are questions of values. So that's what scientism is. It's an idea which I think is clearly false. I think philosophers understand how false it is, that you can derive public policy or statements of ought from factual statements. A famous philosopher named David Hume
Yeah.
suggested that was a kind of logical fallacy. And worse than being a logical fallacy, it's used as absolutely you suggest to shield discussion of values, which should be at the heart of public policy debate. Well, I thought populism could be its evil twin because that can sometimes simply ignore facts. And facts, of course, are relevant to our public policies. Uh, ought at least implies can, as other philosophers have suggested. We are limited by the way we behave, by physical facts about the world as in our policy choices. There's no doubt about that. There are constraints, and science can tell us things about that. And so the idea that simply we should disregard science, and sometimes I think the populists suggest this because science is made up by scientists who are elitists, and we the people can disregard their factual pronouncements or think that we don't even have to take heed of them. That's also a bad idea for public
Yeah.
discourse. So this builds to what's good public discourse. And what's good public discourse is when we take the best science, which is always also, we understand, has to be changing often at times. We can't be always
Provisional.
confident of it. But we
Yeah.
use that, and we use that simply as a jumping off point to debate what we should do based on our values. So certainly scientific facts can be relevant to our public policy debates, but they're not really determinative, or at least very rarely determinative of it. And certainly, science should not be used to shut down debates about policy. And I wrote it in the context of COVID, where of course we are sometimes seeing follow the science as a way of shutting down debate.
Yeah. So, scientism and populism, you have called these evil twins, and I think it's a great way to get the idea across that there are problems on both ends of this bit of a spectrum, and we want to avoid both somehow or other. We need to kind of walk that tightrope between just bowing to all the scientific claims on the one hand and really sticking our heads in the sand on the other. So now I want to jump back to the beginning of the article, and in a sense, we're going to kind of walk through it a little bit, but I'm going to ask some questions that sort of jump from it into other issues. Um, Back at the beginning of the article, you name lockdowns a common government tactic in what President Donald Trump called the war on the coronavirus, and climate change. You name lockdowns and climate change as two topics, the discussion of which is particularly likely to lead policy advocates to call out, follow the science. Well, what makes those two topics so prone to be handled that way?
Well, I think there are two reasons. One, there is science that's relevant to it. Whereas I don't think you would see so many people arguing, at least that the physical science are relevant to tax policy. So there's that grain of truth in it. And then these topics are extremely contentious. They have enormous. Some of the policies have enormous costs, and people will say, "Well, these costs really aren't worth paying." And the response is, "Well, we just shouldn't talk about these costs. We have the science behind us." So those are the two aspects. Again, there's an element of truth there. These are topics where the science is surely relevant, but there are also topics where the government often wants people to pay a lot of costs, and there are questions. There are always questions, as always, about policies, about costs and benefits. And we need to look at those questions. And sometimes the benefits and costs, how even we evaluate them, depend on our values. And those aren't answered by science, but particularly because they're contentious and people might have different views about that, it's easier for those on one side of the debate to say, well, this is decided by science. So as to suggest there's not something really to debate, because they have a view often driven by values that they actually don't want to debate on the value side. I think those are the reasons that these are central. These are so often subjects that call forth that mantra.
Okay. Now, you offer a bit of a history of how what you're calling scientism became entrenched in American politics. And you start off with an 1887 paper by the then political science professor Woodrow Wilson, who later became America's 28th president, and who led us through World War I and fought hard, though unsuccessfully, to lead the United States into the League of Nations, a precursor to the United Nations. Wilson, of course, was a progressive, and you later tie progressivism and scientism together. Why is scientism particularly attractive to progressives?
Well, so let me give a little background here. Of course, Woodrow Wilson is a theorist of the Constitution, and his idea at some times was he hoped to get politics out of politics, which was a progressive idea. And the whole idea of the administrative state was his complaint about the Constitution was that the politics was really messy and often done in a way that was not coherent to principle. And he thought there really should be a whole nother branch of governance. And the branch of governance was the administrative state. It wasn't just that this was a different agency. This was a different way of doing governance, a governance that it wasn't
Mm-hmm.
going to be dependent on politics and therefore debates about values, but could be a kind of transmission belt of science, including social science, not only the physical sciences, a transmission belt of those sciences from experts in the government to social policy. And the reason I think that it's attractive to progressives is, of course, that otherwise politics is messy, and progressives who are generally reformists, who want to reform society and in some kind of ideal, it's difficult because people have all these different ideas. It's hard to corral them. They go backwards, they go forwards. It's much easier if we have a kind of scientific battering ram. And so that would be a kind of realist view of why
Yeah.
progressives have seized on this, I think, because it's a battering ram for other forms of social reform. But there's also the idea behind it that politics, particularly in modernity, really doesn't meet the conditions of modernity, which are so fast changing, so raise all sorts of people's actions can raise all sorts of extra what are called in economics externalities, cost to other people. It'll just be too slow to go by the process of politics. Our constitution is designed, our federal constitution is designed to actually be extremely slow moving. We have to get a bill passed, you have to go through the House and the Senate. They often maybe not be controlled by the same parties, but they certainly aren't always in sync, and get the signature of the president. That's really very difficult. It's difficult even if you have all of them, as the current president is actually showing. It's hard to get with bare majorities much policy enacted, and therefore it becomes attractive, particularly for reformers, to have some other mechanism for and that is the administrative state, and at least in Wilson's conception, and it's been surely attacked since then, even by people who are sympathetic to the administrative state, has this very strong scientific aspect, and I would call a scientist aspect, when he thinks that there's a transmission belt from what the science, including the social science, is right through to the policy, right through to the regulation. So that's the connection between
Yeah.
progressivism, I think, and scientism.
Is there something about conservative political philosophy that tends to inoculate it against scientism?
I think so. I think it's so. I think there are a few things that make conservatives less enamored of scientism, and that's I think a kind of skepticism also that things are changing that much. So one thing is
Mhm.
there's a kind of constant human nature that you're always dealing with, and so no new science development, because always man is in the picture. That's really, you've got to focus on that. I think that's one idea. And the other idea, I think, is also a skepticism of any centralized structure. So even if you have some science and facts, you still worry about what Wilson wanted, such a powerful administrative state, because people are going to use it as a shield, exactly what we are talking
Mhm.
about today, as a shield for their own policies, that you really can't get out of politics out of politics. And that again goes back to human nature, that human nature is what it is. People are, at least with respect to people who aren't in their own family or they're not closely connected to, relatively self-interested. They're going to figure out how to use the state for rent seeking, and that this whole scientific apparatus is actually not
Mhm.
going to turn out very well. It's much better to have a structure where we slow things down, we're sure, and also we have other ways of creating social norms, either from
Yeah.
states, through the market. So I think that's the reason. It's both the constancy of human nature and the distrust of centralized authority that the administrative state really demands. It's certainly in the strong transmission belt view of the administrative state that Wilson advocates.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things about science, one of the characteristics of it is that it tends not to be localized. That is, the weight of a liter of gasoline is the same whether you're in the United States or Brazil. and so on. All sorts of different things about the physical sciences, anyway, are not at all subject to local variation. And you don't discuss this in your article, but I'm curious. Uh, I can't help wondering if there's something about scientism that helped launch the moves toward the League of Nations, the later United Nations, and later still political globalism, the open borders and increasing governance by global institutions that are largely unaccountable to voters. Uh, this seems to be something that I'm seeing in a number of different arenas. Climate change would be one, the pandemic would be another, but things where it seems like people are saying, let's go to some sort of a global institution to impose these particular policies that we're calling scientific, but that have enormous value judgments built into them. Um, do you see scientism
Well, I think
as
in this sense, I
contributing
do
to that?
think there is a loose connection in this sense that one difference if we're going to bring values in, different people can have different values, and different nations can have different values, and so uh, uh, insofar as scientism is an attempt to crowd out discussion of values, it's also an attempt to crowd out local variation because
Mhm.
it's not obvious that everyone is going to share the same values. Now, obviously, that's a little complicated as well because uh, they're also one of the movements for global governance. So even since the Enlightenment, has been the idea of human rights, and that also could lead
Yeah.
us to a kind of globalism. So I don't think it's the only factor that leads us to
Mhm.
globalism. But I do think it's one of the factors, insofar as at least you think that having some variation in values is consistent with universal human rights, which I think is almost surely true. At least I think our nation was built on that idea. Federalism is the idea that localism matters and that the rules for California don't have to be the same rules for Mississippi. I do think there is that sense that we move, and then I guess maybe another sense is insofar as the people who are going to be in charge of the transmission belt are elites. That also lends
Yeah.
itself to globalism because we can screen out the elite of the elite at the global stage. So there are some connections. I wouldn't want to overemphasize that. I think you could be
Yeah.
in
Good point.
favor of a variety of global institutions without buying into scientism. I'm myself am fairly sympathetic to uh, trade among nations, which is a kind of
Yeah.
openness, a kind of globalism. But I do think there is that connection, at least to some aspects of the idea of globalism, which would create, in
Yeah.
some ways, would like to create an administrative state, except on the global level. And so I think that's
Yeah.
one can see why that would be people who are not sympathetic to variation in values would be attracted to that.
Yeah. I think that's a really good distinction. I tend to try to make that distinction as between economic globalism, free trade on the one hand, and governmental globalism, where we have lots of institutions at the global level that frankly have little or no accountability to private persons in the various countries that are involved in them. Now, I
Well, that
want
I
to
think
dig
goes
a little
exactly.
deeper.
Please. That also goes
I,
exactly to the point about the difference between conservatives and liberals, right? They're very concerned about what political scientists would call agency costs because of human nature,
yeah,
versus the idea sometimes of kind of scientism. We don't really need to worry about agency costs because there's actually a science that's going to deliver what's sound. And so I do think there's
yeah,
that fundamental distinction.
yeah. Well, I do want to dig a little deeper into it. You do write in the article that scientism helped to fuel a move in American government to put, quote, fewer constitutional restraints on administrative agencies, unquote. which are, as administrative agencies, as distinct from legislatures, they're less accountable to the public because they're not directly subject to popular vote. Their personnel often survive through multiple administrations of both major parties. So the scientific movement tends to favor the administrative state over the legislature because administrative agencies were constrained by science. Administrative agencies were constrained by science. My first question to arise from this is, how did Wilson and others come to the understanding that administrative agencies are constrained by science while legislatures aren't?
Well, I think it comes from this idea of his strong distinction between politics, which he sees as, and in common with many progressives, as a pretty dirty business. I mean, they're not constrained by anything but voters who are often confused and by the need to get support, which is always shifting, and sometimes by worrying about the demagoguery against them, and then maybe engaging in some demagoguery themselves. So it's a world of, to use a kind of Shakespearean term, it's a world of hurly-burly, right? There's no real order there. But
Uh-huh.
administrative agencies are quite different. They're different in a variety of ways. One, they're different in the people who inhabit them. They're people more like people Wilson dealt with as president of Princeton, the people with PhDs who have high education. They're insulated from the hurly-burly of politics precisely because they transcend um, administration, and
Okay.
they don't have to go out on the hustings, so they have time for reflection, and they're therefore going to naturally, this again according to Wilson, be much more influenced by science. They're going to really be constrained by by their reflections, by their expertise. That's going to put them on the straight and narrow in a way we just can't
Yeah.
predict that politicians are going to be. That's his
Okay.
ideal, and there's a whole discussion in what are called the ages of administrative law of this idea of the transmission belt view of administrative law, which Wilson is really the ultimate progenitor of. As I say, not everyone, even sympathetic to administrative agencies, agrees with that. One can sort of see why you might think that's doubtful again, because of human
Hmm.
nature, that bureaucrats are also going to be self-interested. They're just going to maximize different things than politicians. That doesn't mean they're going to necessarily pay much more attention always to science, and they're going to have their own values.
Okay.
That those critiques have been made by a variety of people about that image of the administrative agency. But I think that's
Yeah.
the idea of what gets the progressive view, at least at the early stages of the administrative agency, going.
Okay, here's a second question that arises from that same recognition that scientism contributed to the administrative agencies being less bound by constitutional restraints than legislatures. What connection would you see, if any, between the phenomenon in American government that you've already talked about and the rise of, for example, the governing structure of the European Union, which also has little accountability to voters in the various European nations?
Well, I don't. I mean, certainly the European Union is has some. I think again, you made a nice distinction. The European Union began as a free trading association, really
Yeah.
largely, and but then the European Union has had many greater uh, ambitions over time. And there it started to be a union. And particularly, what's interesting about the European Union compared to the United States, I'm no great expert on the European Union, is that the legislature is relatively less powerful than the commission. In other words,
Hmm.
still, you might say in the United States, at least nominally, and often the case, is the legislature that is really very central. In the European Union, it's the European Commission that is the central actor. And the European
Yeah.
Commission looks much more like an administrative agency writ large. And so
Yeah.
that's a kind of substitute. Now, I want to be careful there. Some people have suggested that we are moving to a world where it's the administrative agencies that do almost all the work, and we reversed our structure, and it's just Congress that is, in some sense, a check on the administrative agencies. But
Hmm.
even the idea of the European Union is much more like a structure where the administrative agency has primacy.
Yeah. I was just reading recently in the Federalist Papers, I've forgotten now which number, but Madison discusses how he thought that the legislature, the Congress, was always going to be far and away the most powerful branch of the federal government, largely because it holds the purse strings. And yet, over the last, 60 years or so, we've seen enormous growth of power in the executive branch, partly because Congress has taken up the habit of passing pretty broad, vague legislation and then leaving it to agency heads to decide exactly what this means and how to apply it. So it's sort of dumped its own responsibility on the agencies. And I think partly this itself may actually stem from a kind of a scientism that says, okay, they're the experts, they'll know what to do with this. We're just ordinary lay people, we don't. And they're forgetting that, as you've put it, values have to play really the central role. I mean, science can
Yes,
answer some factual questions relevant to policy, but ultimately you've got to go to the values. But there's
but
a
that may be
third
actually
question along.
a
Go
little
ahead.
too kind to Congress in this sense that I think members of Congress are often helped out by delegation. So what they can do is they can delegate to the agencies and then complain when the agencies don't do
Yeah,
what they say they're going to do. And that actually
exactly.
insulates them from criticism. So they've done something for the problem, but then the agencies mess up and they say, well, that wasn't actually what we meant. And so this again
Yeah,
shows the problem, right, with the administrative state is it actually allows for the sloughing off of duties. Sometimes, again, you might even say this is very similar to what some of these politicians are doing, saying follow the science. Let's give it over to the experts because that'll make for better policy. Well, what it's certainly going to do is make for better reelection prospects for the
right.
members of Congress.
Yeah. Um, the Davos crowd, the World Economic Forum, also started out basically with the intent of trying to enlarge free trade, bring greater freedom of economic movement around the world. Uh, and yet, more recently, it's gone more and more into sort of governmental directions. Do you see scientism as having contributed to the goals of the Davos crowd and what it's calling the Great Reset?
Um, I don't know. Again, I think insofar as they're progressives, I think for some of the same reasons we've suggested, yes, for some of the same reasons that that allows us to get around the messy problems, which even are great, more messy. We've got to change all these uh, countries, which may have very diverse political systems and very diverse values. Uh, it's not surprising to me. I mean, there's a famous line, I think sometimes it's called O'Sullivan's Law after John O'Sullivan, which suggests that any organization that's not sort of clearly anchored in the right moves to the left. So I think there's something
Yeah.
of that in it as well. So I don't think it's just scientism that's responsible for it. It's more that scientism, I think, is used uh, uh, for the same reason that sometimes the rise of the administrative state is justified by scientist principles.
Mhm. Okay. Now, two other terms that are fairly closely related to scientism are technocracy and scientocracy. The latter is a more recently coined term, I think. Technocracy has been around since the late 19th century. Um, how would you distinguish scientism, as you've written about it, from either technocracy or scientocracy?
Well, I think so. Scientism, I think, is the idea that science dictates policy. Technocracy, I think, is the idea that more, I don't want to say that it's completely distinct, but it's more the idea that there are technical solutions to our political problems. And again, that idea has like scientism has as an element of truth. Certainly, technology. I indeed wrote a book saying how technology could address some technological innovations, might help us with some problems in democracy. So there's absolutely some truth to that. On the other hand, I think the problem, or the critique of technocracy, is again the conservative critique of it, is that um, that it really can't ultimately solve the problems of politics because they're very much rooted in human nature, and there are not easy technical fixes to most of them. So I see it as having a similar dialectic in some sense to scientism, having some truth in the sense that technology is relevant to solving political problems, but that again, it has to be subordinated to our values. We've really got to, first of all, define the political problems by our values before even we can figure out what the how new technology can help them. So in that sense, it's similar.
Okay.
Um, but it's, I think, focuses more on new, as the name suggests, on new technological innovations, whereas scientism really focuses on how fundamental science should guide and indeed dictate our values, dictate our policy.
Mhm. Yeah. I, I I tend to think that technocracy and scientocracy put more of the emphasis on the scientists should rule, whereas I see scientism as more of a sort of subjective attitude among voters, among legislators, among uh, members of the executive branch, even among judges, a subjective attitude that there is something so uh, almost holy, so unchallengeable about science that when somebody drags science in as the rationale for a proposed policy, uh, debate just needs to come to an end. We all need to just sort of bow down to that. But uh,
That's
those are
true. I mean,
just, go ahead.
I would say that scientism does have some element of that the scientists should rule. I mean, that's why in with the administrative agency, it's essentially gives a lot more power to experts, and I think that was connected to the rise of
Yeah,
scientism. So I think there's a lot to what you say, but even scientism within itself carries an idea that something about who should be the rulers, or at least who should have more influence.
yeah, yeah. You mentioned that Wilson's embrace of what you call scientism led to his wanting what you termed in the article a conveyor belt model of administrative law. Here tonight in our discussion, you've referred to it as a transmission belt, I think. Describe that model for us. Why would you call it a conveyor belt or transmission belt model?
Well, the idea is you'd find it is very much science. You'd figure out what the science is, including, as I say, social science. He didn't distinguish. We mostly have talked in climate science and the COVID about the actual natural sciences and their role, but including social science. And you'd figure out what the facts were, and those facts would tell us what rules the agency would have. So that's the conveyor belt model. We convey,
Okay.
we go from a body of scientific knowledge, broadly construed, to rules. And the problem with that is there's a role for values, of course, in trying to figure out what facts are relevant. It really doesn't tell us. It's a very common
Yeah.
view at the time about progressivism. There's another idea, it's called the Brandeis Brief in constitutional law,
Hmm.
which was, well, you really shouldn't look at the original meaning of the Constitution, just look at the social facts at the time, and that will tell us how to rule on the case. And so it's a very common view that the facts and the facts at a kind of high level, sifted by science, are going to dictate our ideas, was prominent in both progressive ideas about the administrative state and even about constitutional adjudication.
Okay. Now, although the conveyor belt model of administration arose within the progressive movement, you report that before long, even most liberals, and there's a significant overlap between progressivism and liberalism, uh, American liberalism anyway. Even most liberals before long abandoned this conveyor belt model of administration. Why did they do that?
Well, I think first of all they did it in reaction to pushback from other people, so it wasn't necessarily wholly voluntary. The idea that this and also the idea that this just didn't work. I mean, there were some great failures of administrative agencies. They made all sorts of mistakes. Even the liberals realized that much of the New Deal was kind of mistaken, many mistakes, and how are we going to avoid some of these mistakes? I think also there is a reaction, I think, a reaction back to the values of more democratic, more value oriented methods of governance, is a reaction against totalitarianism. I mean, there
Okay.
is, of course, Marxism had a different kind of scientism, for instance. And
Yeah.
there's a reaction against that. And it's reflected in something called the Administrative Procedure Act, where essentially, one way at a high level of generality, I know your listeners won't be interested in the details, it tries to invite the public back in through noticing what is called notice and comment rulemaking. So it's not just the agency that is in charge. We get the
Hmm.
public back in, making comments and trying to understand what they want. And that doesn't mean that we still don't look at science, that the experts don't bring that to bear, but it's no longer a transmission belt. We let much more of the messiness of politics and
Yeah.
values back in. And I think those are the basic two reasons. One, there were just a lot of mistakes. And then also a sense that really what was valuable about our system of politics was a public participation. And that was very hard to square with the conveyor belt model of the administrative state.
Okay. All right. Now, you wrote in the article that that people who are prone to say follow the science are also prone to ignore trade-offs. And you also wrote that hiding behind science is bad for policy and worse for the civic health of the nation. And you said the lockdown is a case in point. Explain how that worked and the role of why trade-offs are important to that issue.
Well, so so I don't want to. I want to be clear. I don't want to say that every policy pursued in COVID was a mistake. I think some were right, but let me just
Yeah.
take one example, which is the 5-year-old is very much on my mind. Um, there are real trade-offs when they close so many of the schools, and so many children really lost a good deal of a year of education. That's going to have an enormous amount of effects. And it's true that having schools, of course, also there's a debate about the science. It turns out that schools weren't perhaps the great vector of a disease that some people feared, but there's a debate about the science. But we had to trade off because the science was just focusing on people dying from COVID, right? That was what scientists were focusing on. How many people were going to die of COVID? We had all these graphs and how many. But there was another side to that, and this is just an example of it. I'm sure there were a lot of other sides, just not this one. This is the side that I think is most
Mhm.
obviously that I think was neglected, was that students, particularly young students, for whom being online was, let me, as a parent, I can attest that that was worse than useless to have 5-year-olds
Hmm.
learning online, that that was just enormously costly. And the reason I think that it was blinded by science is that just wasn't what this science was about. The science of COVID was about
Yeah.
figuring out who would die from COVID, how likely it was people were going to die from COVID, how we good ideas about how we could vaccinate people from COVID. All these ideas, which were fine to go on, but they didn't allow us to focus on what was really important. One thing that's
Yeah.
really important, which
Yeah.
is educating our children. And then, of course, interest groups and politicians. Some A good example of this would be the teachers' unions. They wanted to maximize their interests, which was the health and safety of uh, their teachers above all, right? Nothing
Yeah.
else
Yeah.
should matter. And if you look at where schools closed, there actually been studies done on this. It's not where the COVID outbreaks were greatest; it's where the teachers' unions were strongest. And so that's a
Yeah.
good
Yeah.
example, I think, of scientism. They were using the mantra "follow the science" to follow essentially their own interest and not to I
Yeah.
think take the kind of
Yeah.
appropriate trade-off. So that's an
Yeah.
example of that's to me again was the example most on my mind. Locking down schools or not having schools was I think a policy
Yeah.
a great policy mistake, and which we're going to pay for years to come, because there'll be my prediction is social scientists will show there is an echo of that 10, 20 years later in that generation. Of course, who it's going to hurt most are probably not people like my daughter, but people who more depend on schooling outside the
Education.
home. And so it's a really
Yeah.
very sad example.
Yeah. Yeah. Both President Trump, excuse me, and President Biden have depended really heavily on coronavirus task forces that consisted almost exclusively of medical experts, people with wonderful skills for which we should all be immensely grateful. Yet, what you're saying suggests that those task forces should have included people from other areas of expertise, not just other fields of science, but fields well outside of science, or at least outside what we've traditionally called science, not including the social sciences. What other fields should have been represented on those task forces, and what could they have contributed?
Well, I think economists, because of a focus on trade-offs, but educators, a whole other group of people. And so I think you make a nice bureaucratic point. You might say, well, of course, after they're figured out the science, the politicians could bring such people in. The difficulty is, I think, that once you have this group with their recommendations, it's very difficult to bring other people in, such as the sense of prestige and sense of political neutrality of natural scientists. So I think your point that it's a organizational mistake to have task forces simply filled with scientists when the recommendations are going to be ultimately social policy recommendations is a very powerful one. I mean, the one I hadn't actually thought of, but you really, so if I just underscore your excellent point, you really want to map your organizational structures in government to make sure that you have a mixture of recommendations um, before sort of the recommendations become public, because
Yeah,
otherwise it's going to allow this kind of scientism, because it does have a tremendous prestige as well as a way of shielding people from making the trade-off. So that's actually an interesting point.
yeah, yeah. Just tying back to what you said a little bit ago, it's much better for a politician. Yeah, I'm quoting here from your article. You said it is much better for a politician to claim she's following science when she's closing the schoolhouse door than admit that she is in bed with the teachers union. So some politicians might use follow the science as a smokescreen for serving special interest groups. How does that
Oh, absolutely.
respond?
I think
How
that
does that
is.
work?
I mean, I think that's just
How does that
absolutely,
work in
again, going back
response
to
to?
what politicians do, right? What politicians are
Yeah,
interested in doing. So this goes back to this issue, because it's a
yeah,
very interesting problem in politics. So what political
yeah,
scientists say, and it's sort of well known for the economics, that really who has more leverage in society are interest groups or special interest groups.
yeah,
These include not only teachers' unions, but trade associations, all sorts of groups in society. And politicians therefore pay a lot of attention to them. On the other hand, they actually don't want to show they're paying a lot of attention to them. So this is a
right,
perfect way of dealing with it. And precisely because other groups like the ordinary citizen don't pay a lot of attention to politics, quite rationally. There's something called rational ignorance. Since your vote is very unlikely to decide an election, it's very
hmm,
foolish to spend all of your time looking. Hey, look, there are interesting ways of making money. There's interesting entertainment opportunities for you. Why spend all your time being a citizen and something you're ultimately not going to uh, influence much? And that's even
yeah,
better if if politicians can set up a kind of informational structure that makes it very difficult for people to understand what's going on. And so
yeah,
following the science, well, that just is a great blur to most people, quite understandably. It's not because they're not smart. It's because they don't spend much time on it, and so this, in some sense, disables them while serving the special interest. So there's a particular danger to scientists. It's particularly
yeah,
scientism. It's particularly useful to deflect the ordinary citizen who's not very focused on politics, but as understandably from maybe his school days some respect for science while serving interest groups. So this is a real
okay,
dilemma of the modern politics, which I fear we're not
yeah.
going to get rid of.
Yeah, yeah. Possibly that arises out of one of your earlier points that conservatives believe in sort of the constancy of human nature. So I guess we're going to continue to face these challenges for a long time. One more question. We have just a few minutes left. So, one more question about the article itself, one that brings us full circle to the evil twins of scientism and populism. You wrote there, by distorting policy, scientism in politics also leads to political divisions. Some voters recognize that politicians are hiding behind science and making decisions that they may dislike. And the result often is an anti scientific populism that not only rejects the scientific facade of decision making, but the science as well. And this natural reaction makes rational debate and good policy more difficult because science is indeed relevant to many political decisions, even if it is not determinative of them. Now, I'm particularly interested to understand how it is that you think scientism breeds distrust of science, uh, something something I think is really tragic because real science, the sort of thing that the late Nobel Prize winning physicist Richard Feynman so cherished, something humbly bowing to facts rather than clutching to preferred theories, it's a tremendously valuable thing, but this distrust, growing distrust of scientists and science even as a process in the population as a whole, I think is a dangerous thing, and yet at the same time, perhaps an understandable thing because of the process that you described.
Yes, well, it's a terrible dialectic that I describe at the end of the article, and it's the idea that some people are going to get wise to the idea that politicians are using science to make decisions they not only disagree with, but they think with some good reason, like closing the schools, are not very well, that certainly don't help them, and are really not very well based in science. And so they're going to turn on the scientists. We've already seen that to some degree. Fauci, who's obviously a very respectable scientist, I think by being the face of sometimes scientism in government has become a much, not, I think began, if you asked 8 years ago, he would have been a beloved figure. I don't think that's true. He's a very polarizing figure today. And I think that's,
Hmm.
I'm not blaming him in particular, but in some sense, he's the face and he doesn't make ultimately the decisions. It's the politicians who use him, but in using him as a shield, he becomes a kind of a scapegoat for their bad decisions. And
Hmm.
since he represents, of course, science as a whole loses some repute, at least in certain circumstances,
Yeah.
and that makes it easier for populist demagogues to say, well, science, that's irrelevant. We can do what we want. Let's forget about um, vaccination, which I think, at least for many people, again, I'm cautious here, is a very good idea, and allows them to dismiss it because the science seems to have been used for other bad things, and so that's a really terrible aspect of this.
Yeah.
And again, it's not surprising if you go back to the framers, they were fearful of demagogues, and demagogues can use anything,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
they use real grievances. And what this is doing is giving people more real grievances and turning them against something that's institutions that are useful in society.
Yeah. I like to try to sort of make a distinction between the term the science, okay, and simply science. I think almost invariably when people talk about the science, they're oversimplifying enormously because really there are not an awful lot of things, scientific questions that are of significant relevance to public policy issues that are not in themselves among scientists uh, being debated rather hotly. And so, whereas we can speak of science, this sort of process that a variety of different scholars of different focuses use, to speak of the science is kind of to paint a monolith. And I just don't think that very well represents what scientists are really all about,
Well,
though even some scientists will do that.
science is a
Go ahead.
variety of propositions with greater degrees of certainty. You're always on question where you are in the frontier of science is where you're
Yeah.
debating. And it's always important to remember that where we are, I mean, I think there are things that are incontrovertibly true with respect to science, but you're right that many of them are not. And the question is, how do we take account of that uncertainty, even in our policy making? As you might not be
Yeah.
surprised, as I'm sure you know, uncertainty, how one actually uses, how one evaluates uncertainty in the course of policy making is itself a very complicated question for policy, and so
It sure is.
that we always have to recognize.
Yeah. One last question before I ask you to just make your own concluding comments. How can ordinary people, our listeners, the American public, how can they protect themselves against uh, either embracing scientism themselves unintentionally, or being the victims of scientism as it tends to be used in public debate?
Well, I think the most important matter here is to read widely into different sources on all sides of a political debate, because sides of responsible people on the right and the left, when people misuse facts against their position, they'll point that out. And what you need to
Hmm.
do is to have a kind of epistemic openness to different
Good.
viewpoints. That's, I think, the greatest way, because people will bring people. We're making these points about schools closing. This is not original with me. People were making them at the time, and so widely reading with different kinds of sources who don't all agree with one another is the best protection.
Yeah, great. Well, John, thank you very, very much for joining us on the program this evening. Do you have any concluding thoughts that you want to get out that I didn't give you opportunity for?
No, I don't think anything in particular. I think the thing to remember, which I've tried to stress, is to be against scientism is not to be against science. It's to actually to embrace science. And I think your distinction between not embracing the science, but embracing science in all its multiplicity and all its complexity, it is a
And
different kind
messiness.
of messiness than politics. Both are
Yeah,
messy, but both are objects can be of great social good if we keep that in mind.
great. Well, again, John, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been a real pleasure for me. And I'm going to continue to watch what you publish because I think you've got a lot of wisdom for us all. Thanks again, everybody, for
Thanks very
joining us
much. I
this
very
evening.
much enjoyed being with you, Dr. Besner.
All right, thank you. Uh, just a reminder that during the month of October, we are offering to send as our thanks for a 100% tax deductible gift of literally any size, my new book, Biblical Foundations for Economics. To make your request for one, simply go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, write in promo code 21-10 and the title Biblical Foundations for Economics, and we'll be glad to send you a copy of this brand new book. Next week, our guest will be Dr. Gordon Wilson, author of the book A Different Shade of Green and contributor to the documentary video The Riot and the Dance. Dr. Wilson has some really fascinating insights into the natural world, into biology and ecology and the like, and I think that you will enjoy that discussion a great deal. Meanwhile, thanks again for tuning in to From the Stacks this evening. God bless you, and well, keep the rubber side down.